The Supreme Court hears oral arguments over President Biden's ghost gun rule. Plus, the court also agrees to take up Mexico's lawsuit against the gun industry. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. The big news this week, obviously, it revolves around the Supreme Court. We had, in the second day of the October session, already an argument around a gun case. The Supreme Court heard Vanderstock v. Garland, which has to deal with the Biden administration's ATF rule that reclassified unfinished firearm parts kits as completed firearms in a bid to go after so-called ghost guns. And the justices heard the back and forth. It was about a 90-minute oral argument this week. And what I think was most noteworthy about it was a little bit different than the last time that they heard an oral argument over an ATF rule, which wasn't that long ago.
It was, yeah. It was pretty different tone to the oral arguments. They were still pretty long. An hour and a half, I think, is fairly long for the Supreme Court, which usually does an hour, I think, if I'm remembering my cases right. They've been going pretty long on these gun cases, interestingly. But yeah, this one I definitely felt different from the Garland case, the bump stock ban, which is in theory, is a similar case. It's the same basic process that the ATF went through to get these two rules. They used federal rulemaking. They interpreted pre-existing federal statutes that have been around for decades that they had previously interpreted differently. And so you would think they'd be pretty interconnected, but I don't know that the court sees it that way, right? At least from what we were hearing in oral arguments, this one, as you wrote in a member's piece, seemed to go much better for the government in this case. The conservative justices seemed a lot more skeptical at the objections to this rule, the kit rule, than they were to the bump stock rule. And, why don't you just walk us through a little bit of what you got in that member's piece of why it seemed like, what were some of the comments we heard from the different justices that gave an indication that maybe the ATF has a better chance of surviving this time around, their rule has a better chance of surviving? Sure. Yeah. So what stuck out to me the most was, obviously the liberal justices on the court seemed fairly receptive to the rule, but that's not, not unexpected. But what stuck out was there was a handful of conservative justices that also seemed to, as you said, express some skepticism to the objections to the rule. So one particular exchange stuck out to me was Justice Alito asked Solicitor General Prelogar, who's arguing obviously to defend the ATF's position, and he asked sort of a probing hypothetical, like, look, I have a pen and I have a pad. Is this a grocery list? Essentially trying to get at, if these constituent parts, does that make it a firearm? And she had an answer. Well, no, those individual parts can be used for other things other than a grocery list. So we wouldn't consider that the same sort of scenario. And then Justice Barrett kind of jumped in on this and said, narrow the hypothetical and said, well, what if I ordered from HelloFresh? It was funny that a company got a name drop in a Supreme Court it's
argument.
Almost like a sponsored ad read in there. Because Alito's other analogy was like, oh, what if I have all the ingredients for a Western omelet? Right. Yeah. I got eggs and peppers and onions, but they're all laid out. Is it like, at what point does it actually become a Western omelet, I guess, was sort of what he was getting at. And
that's right.
And yeah, that's when Barrett came in with she must be listening to a lot of podcasts or watching YouTube or something.
I said getting those ad reads.
Yeah, getting the HelloFresh mention in.
Yeah, but she essentially asked, like, what if I ordered a specific kit from HelloFresh, and it had all the ingredients for an omelet? Does that then count? And that's the Solicitor General essentially jumped on that and was like, yep, that's the apt analogy for this rule. And she seemed to be sort of satisfied by that.
Right.
Which
and
obviously doesn't bode well.
Bit of a weird, to be honest, it's not a quite exact analogy in my mind. Either one of those, even the Alito one, because the whole idea here is that the receiver, which is the regulated part, right, it isn't actually finished. You have to it's not just that it comes in a kit with other parts, because you can buy, the ATF doesn't even dispute that you can buy completed serialized commercial lowers that are stripped with parts and put those together, and it's not an issue. But I don't know. So it's a little bit different. It's be like if you had to, I don't know, grow the peppers yourself and then put them in with pre-bought stuff. I don't know. Either way, it does. I think you're right as far as what it indicates about perhaps where Barrett is leaning, though.
Yeah. And you saw also Justice Roberts had a different similar exchange with the attorney Patterson, who was representing the side challenging the rule, where it wasn't so much of like a legal exchange, but he at least was like, why do people even want these these unfinished firearms
pretty
parts?
Skeptical that there were the unfinished parts, that there was some other legitimate use to them besides finishing them and making them into a gun.
Yeah. And the attorney tried to explain that there's hobbyists out there that they enjoy, privately manufacturing these firearms. It's sort of like he compared it to folks that like to tune up their cars and work on their cars. And Roberts didn't seem to be buying that at all.
And to be fair, like, I mean, that is why people buy the kits. I mean, honestly, one thing I thought probably should have come up is like, and maybe that's just the plaintiffs didn't think this was going to be a good argument in front of these justices. But the main reason people buy the unserialized parts, well, there's two. One is because they're criminals who want to use them. Like that's legitimately a thing that happens with these. That was the government's argument, obviously. And the other side is people who have more of a philosophical objection to the government knowing they have guns. They may not be criminals in any way, right? But they have this philosophical opposition to, or political philosophical opposition to, government tracing of firearms, government, knowing what citizens have guns. And that's the other reason why people do this. It's yes, there's some hobbyist enjoyment coming from finishing a polymer 80 lower. I mean, the polymer 80 stuff, probably even less so, maybe more so with the 80% metal, like AR lowers where you have to mill them out. And there's a little more skill involved with that. But generally the reason people who aren't criminals are buying and using these is because they have a philosophical objection to the government knowing they have firearms. And that's not necessarily because they want to use them in crime. It's more of a philosophical belief surrounding the Second Amendment and its bulwark against tyranny, right? That this is a common reason why people buy these kits. That didn't come up at all, though. And the only alternative they gave was this idea of like hobbyists like to craft their guns, which is certainly true. I mean, I like to build my own guns, but I don't. You don't even need to do that from scratch from an 80% lower to fulfill that enjoyment. I mean, I'm sure it does add some level of enjoyment for some people, but mainly people do that because they, at least anyone I've ever spoken to or read comments from, they do it for a political reason. They do it for this commitment to a Second Amendment ideology, right? That's why it's less so about the mechanical enjoyment of milling out the last 20%. And it's all colloquial, right? 80% lower is not a technical measurement or a legal measurement, which they got into in the oral arguments. But, finishing that last little bit is not the main reason why people buy these, just because they like to drill the holes themselves or whatever. It's mainly the political reason.
And to that point about the 80% coming up, that was also a section of the oral argument where Barrett, again, said some things that I think if you were hoping to see this rule get struck down may trouble you, because the attorney Patterson brought up this so-called 80% rule, which its technical term is the critical machining operations test, where the ATF would look at, well, have you done do you need to do critical machining operations to turn this into a completed frame or whatever? And that's how they would kind of decide. And he was saying that was the proper way to sort of adjudicate these things. And that was the is
he was kind of saying, like, this is something we find acceptable, which is basically just how they've previously done this. Like, because the ATF had a different rule. Thomas pointed this out at the beginning. Their kit rule now is not what they used to say, right? They used to say, basically that as long as you can't take the part and build a gun with it, a functioning firearm. That's why if you buy like an 80% AR lower, it's not going to have the trigger well drilled out. And there's not going to be any way for you to put that together with other finished AR parts and actually fire any rounds from it. That's sort of how they were determining this. The critical like machining process still remained for you to actually have to go through to finish this part for it to actually function as a gun.
Right.
And that's what they've used for years. And it was sort of, to be honest, like it was much more of a thing for regulating the commercial firearms makers, because they don't make these pieces finished all in one shot. They'll make castings and then they'll send them to be machined to a certain degree. And then they send them to oftentimes they'll have to go through a couple stops before they get to that finished part. And this rule was created to try and like loosen up some of the regulations so they don't have to start serializing it as soon as it's pulled out of the cast. Right. So that, this is, was more of an industrial regulation. And it has, to the government's point, I suppose it's become easier to finish these parts at home than it used to be with the introduction of things like the polymer 80 lowers or frames because they're made of plastic, which is easier to work with personal grade machines or even files or what have you. And you don't need big industrial machines to finish these frames and receivers anymore. So I don't know, that seemed to, but I think that was an aspect of the ease of finishing became an issue, I think, for a number of these justices as well. And yeah, also this idea that Barrett points out that that test, the previous test, the machining test, whether it's got all the critical components machined out or not, she said, isn't that also just made up?
Yeah.
It's not in the statute anywhere. It's just kind of what the ATF and the industry decided on in the 60s or whatever.
Right.
So she wasn't too amenable to the idea that was that should hold water any more than the ATF's new test should.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And look, like we've said before, with all of these cases, oral arguments are what they are, that they don't necessarily mean that, outcomes are the same as the tenor of oral arguments, but they do sometimes offer some insights into the thinking of justices where they're at on these questions. So they tell us some things, but they don't tell us everything. And
then Kavanaugh also had a couple comments that were, maybe some of his concerns may have been assuaged in oral arguments. That was your takeaway as well, right?
Yeah, it's similar to what he brought up during the bump stock. This was actually a similarity between the two, where he expressed concern for criminal defendants being swept up by these rules. So he asked about, what if someone who sincerely does not know about this rule change or sincerely thinks they are complying with this rule change, is the ATF going to go after them? Right. And the Solicitor General said, well, no, that it's called a mens rea, basically your mindset in committing a crime. They have to be willfully violating this rule for the ATF to go after them. And he said, oh, okay, thank you. That, he didn't say it explicitly, but it seemed to assuage a little bit of his concern about criminal prosecution. And then at one point he also said her interpretation has force was a sentence he said. So I don't know what you can take from that, but seem to be lending credence.
He was definitely mainly concerned with what the standard of the law would be for prosecuting people under this rule. Yeah. And, she said for the most part, you'd have to have a willful violation. There was something about background checks. Yeah. Not requiring that willful violation standard. So, I don't know if he was totally satisfied, but he did seem to be, he didn't continue to push her on that stuff other than just like, consider my hypotheticals. She wasn't getting into hypotheticals at first. And so he like a lot of these, they didn't seem to push the government too hard on any of these particular points. Because the government's position here, I will say, like, there was a lot of questioning around this idea of sort of moving one part of the law to the other part of the law, which is kind of what the ATF is trying to do. Because they're in the NFA, there's a section, or in the Gun Control Act, there's a section that talks about readily convertible pieces to machine guns. Something being readily converted into a machine gun is regulated, but that language is not included in the section that talks about frames and receivers of firearms. But the ATF is kind of trying to do that, trying to apply that standard to that section. And so there was some pushback on that concept early on when the government was making its case. So I definitely think the consensus was that from looking at how a number of gun rights lawyers and Second Amendment academics reacted to oral arguments, I think the consensus was more that the government performed really well, and that seemed to be your takeaway as well. I don't know. I'm not as 100% sure how they'll rule. I do agree that oral arguments went much better this time around for the government than last time. There seemed to be like one takeaway that I had was like the Supreme Court. It seemed maybe that they were setting up a standard to where like they're going to apply the same basic framework to all these rules and just kind of like say that the ATF perhaps doesn't have the authority to expand their own breadth of prosecution or breadth of power based on these older laws that haven't been changed by Congress. Like it seemed like if there's a major reinterpretation that all those would go the way that Garland did. But oral arguments in this one indicate more to me that they're just going to actually literally sit there and decide whether every rule comports with the language in the law. Like they're going to go through and decide for themselves. It's kind of what it feels like. I don't know if you got that impression, but it seems like the difference here between Garland and Vanderstock, and we'll see how the ruling goes, but it felt like the difference was that they thought the definition of machine gun at issue in Garland was much more black and white than the definition of frames and receivers in Vanderstock, because frames and receivers aren't defined in the statute. So that does perhaps give a little more leeway to the ATF to define those terms, how they feel makes the most sense. And that's maybe the difference here. They're just, machine gun is pretty explicitly defined in federal law, whereas frame and receiver, not explicitly defined. It was explicitly defined by the ATF in a previous rule that they made themselves. And this new rule changes that. But the underlying statute doesn't give you an explicit definition. That may be why the court sees more flexibility for the ATF in this situation. I don't know, but it does feel like they're going to decide all these on a case by case basis by like going through what the rule says and what the statute says and deciding among the 9 of them whether it makes sense or not, instead of trying to put a more blanket approach on these cases. I don't know.
Especially because in many of these cases, it's the same statute, right? There's not that many federal gun law statutes that rules can be interpreted from. So especially the Biden pistol brace rule, that's back to the NFA, like the Cargill case was. So I think that's right. And I think that is why the tenor of these oral arguments were different than the bump stock ones. Like I said, we'll have to see how the outcome comes out. We won't know until they have basically until next June to issue a decision on this. And so we'll have to see if the actual outcome matches. It's a wait and see kind of a thing. But elsewhere with Supreme Court news, we have them taking up actually another gun related case, not a Second Amendment case again. This is the challenge from the government of Mexico against Smith & Wesson and a whole host of basically the who's who of the American firearms industry, all the big manufacturers and distributors. Listeners, if they will recall, the First Circuit actually made headlines. We covered this story where they essentially said that this lawsuit could go forward. It could bypass the PLCAA, the Protection for Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which is the liability shield for the gun industry. They actually said you can go through that because you've plausibly stated some claims that might fall under an exception. And so we'll let this lawsuit go forward. And the Supreme Court is going to review whether that was a correct decision or not. So potentially big news here.
Yeah. And this is another one where we're going to read some tea leaves again. Because, again, you don't know for sure what's going to happen, but there's some indication here. And one of the interesting things at play, I think, is how similar this is to what happened with the Sandy Hook Remington lawsuit. In that case, the Massachusetts, now that was a state case, so it's slightly different, but the Massachusetts Supreme Court said that there was enough of a claim. That claim was about advertising violating state law, and then leading to the harms associated with the murders of the children at Sandy Hook. But, the same basic, in this one, Mexico is arguing that, Smith & Wesson's policies of what guns they make and how they sell them to wholesalers ends up down the line harming the Mexican government because of cartel. There's a long string of actions in between by distinct individuals who aren't connected to Smith & Wesson. But eventually Mexico is saying down the line, it harms the Mexican government because they have to pay for, additional police to fight cartels and pay for the damages done by American-made guns that make it into criminal hands in Mexico. That's their claim. And so both of these claims, different claims, but same basic idea of trying to pierce that shield, the PLCAA, because the PLCAA, despite what President Joe Biden has repeatedly said, does not give blanket immunity to the gun industry. There are exceptions to it, primarily based on faulty products. You can sue gun companies over faulty products like any other company. They're not protected under the PLCAA for that. But then also, if they're involved in some sort of criminal act or their actions violate the law and then lead to some sort of harm to somebody else, you can sue them in that case. And that's where a lot of these recent cases are more focused on that exception, obviously. Certainly there are liability lawsuits against the gun industry over faulty designs as well. But the ones that get more attention, are these types of suits. Generally because they tend to be more politically motivated and funded or backed by gun control groups, as both these cases were. But regardless, so both of these lower courts in the Sandy Hook case, it was the Massachusetts Supreme Court. In this case, it was, as you mentioned, the First Circuit panel. They ruled, okay, you can go ahead with this claim. They didn't rule that the claim was right or that they're going to win on the merits. They just ruled that you can move forward with this lawsuit because that's effectively getting past the PLCAA, because the PLCAA is designed to stop these kind of lawsuits altogether, because the argument is that they're frivolous lawsuits that are designed to sort of harass the industry and force them to fight these cases for years and spend lots of money, even if the case doesn't have a real chance of winning on the merits. That's the idea. Why this law was created. Whether or not you agree with that's what these cases are doing is a different question. But regardless, so the interesting bit here is that in the Sandy Hook case, they appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, they didn't say anything. They didn't take the case. They decided not to intervene, and that case ended up being settled famously for a lot of money. After Remington went bankrupt, the insurers settled that case. And that was probably in part because it was allowed to proceed past that beginning stage. Now Remington had a lot of that iteration of Remington Arms had a lot of other issues with their core business and the guns they were making, and they weren't performing well in the market. But also they had this big lawsuit they had to contend with that probably contributed to their bankruptcy. And so I don't know if that has an effect here, but this time when a lower court said we're going to allow a case like this to proceed past the PLCAA liability shield, the Supreme Court is taking up the appeal from Smith & Wesson and the other gun makers involved. So, to me, just taking up the case is perhaps a sign of what way they're going to go. We don't know for sure, obviously, as we constantly caution on these whenever we're talking about tea leaf reading at the Supreme Court. But to me, it says, okay, they're probably going to step in and say this is not a viable claim. Now, what impact that will have on Second Amendment jurisprudence, I think, is an open question, because it's Smith & Wesson's main claim. They do have sort of an argument that basically allowing this to go forward, or allowing Mexico, if Mexico wins here, it's sort of a way for Mexico to impose their ideas about gun control on American companies through litigation. Because that's big. Most of Mexico's claims are basically like, Smith & Wesson sells guns we don't think they should sell, and it sells them in a way that is legal in America, but we don't think should be. That's just boils down to what they're doing. They don't have any sort of special claim or evidence that like Smith & Wesson is working with the cartels or anything like that. All their claims are these downstream effects of Smith & Wesson and the company making, and other American gun companies making certain guns that and eventually end up in Mexican crimes. So, you know, Smith & Wesson argues that there's Second Amendment implications from allowing something like that to happen. But their main claim is just about this long chain of causation that Mexico is using, because Mexico is not arguing that Smith & Wesson is directly selling guns to the cartels, or anything close to that. They don't have any evidence close to that. They're just basically saying Smith & Wesson makes guns we don't think they should. They sell them through a legal process in America where it's foreseeable that some of them will end up being acquired by criminals in Mexico and used for crimes in Mexico. But the chain there is, you know, Smith & Wesson makes the gun, they sell it to a wholesaler legally. The wholesaler legally sells it to a retailer, who legally sells it to another party, who then maybe they sell it to the cartels, or someone down the line from there sells it to them, or somebody is committing a crime somewhere along this line, but they don't have any. The claims are not specific to, like, it's a more general approach, right? That it's forced. And this was what the lower court ruled, that because it's foreseeable that some of these guns will eventually end up in criminal hands across the border, the lawsuit can move forward on that basis. But Smith & Wesson's basic claim is like, this is way too removed as far as like from Smith & Wesson, the company's actual actions, for there to be any real liability claim. And so it's entirely possible that the court will just rule on that stuff. And you might even get another unanimous ruling like you had in the NRA case, where it's not really a Second Amendment case. It doesn't really have to do what the court hands down isn't about the Second Amendment jurisprudence, but is a little less controversial and more direct to the specific claims involved. And you might be able to get the liberals on board with something like that, but we'll see.
Yeah. Either way, it'll be big, because it'll be the first time anyway that the Supreme Court has weighed in on the PLCAA. So it'll be the first time that we have Supreme Court precedent on that matter, which has obviously become, as you mentioned, President Biden brings it up all the time. It's become much more of a political football in recent years than it was
his
before.
hobby horse, because Vice President Harris doesn't really talk about it.
That's right. Yeah.
But Biden, it's one of his big things, and has been for a long time. But, you know, and they also might not even address the PLCAA too much, because again, they could just go to that, the claim itself being, the liability being way too far removed from the actions involved for there to be a viable suit. And you don't even really need to get to PLCAA for that, but they could, you know, the Smith & Wesson wants them to do, like they could do something like Satano, where there's a per curiam ruling that's, I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong on procedure on that. I don't know if they would just issue those, or if they'd take the case and then issue a per curiam, but they could do something where it's 2 pages long, and they're like, no, this Smith & Wesson calls it a Rube Goldberg contraption to get from Smith & Wesson's actions to Mexico's claimed harm. And I think that's probably going to be pretty convincing at the Supreme Court level. We'll see if they go any further beyond that and opine on the PLCAA or on the Second Amendment or something. But I kind of doubt it. So we'll see. Yeah.
We'll stay on top of it, obviously, because it'll be a big story, whatever way, you know, whatever comes from it. Moving on to the political realm, we had an interesting interview from Vice President Harris, where she provided slightly more context to her gun ownership that we've talked about. Yeah, slightly emphasis on slightly. She mentioned in a sit-down interview that she owns a Glock. So that's new. That's new information that we didn't know before.
And she shot it. That's basically all I learned at the range.
That's the new info.
Specifically at the range. She was asked on 60 Minutes directly about this, and she was asked when she got it, and she just said a long time ago, basically. And she clarified this wasn't the first time she's talked about it, which is true. She talked about it in 2019 briefly. So we were in the very base level information about her gun ownership. And it's a Glock, which does, to be honest, it leaves many more questions unanswered than what she did answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like, for instance, it's a Glock, which means that it's technically not a safe handgun according to California, because California has something called the handgun roster because of the Unsafe Handgun Act, I believe it's called, where essentially only guns on this roster can be sold to civilians. And to get on the roster, you have to have now only 2 requirements, although Kamala Harris herself was the attorney general who was responsible for adding a third since overturned requirement. But the main requirements are a magazine disconnect safety. So when you remove the magazine, the gun won't fire even if there's a round in the chamber. And then a loaded chamber indicator, and a very specific kind of loaded chamber indicator. Most guns, modern guns, have some sort of loaded chamber indicator.
Yeah, including
usually
Glocks.
They're yeah, and I think you could say most Glocks do, because they have basically a little gap where the chamber meets up with the slide, so you can see if there's brass inside of it. Most guns will have that on the top, and you can look down and see if there's brass in the chamber. Some of them will have like a little like red dot that shows up when there's a loaded chamber. California requires a very specific one that has to have the words written on it that there's a loaded chamber indicator, and it has to stick up in a certain way. So not a lot of guns have that outside of California, even though most of them have loaded chamber indicators. Anyway, Glocks don't have either of those requirements. None of the Glocks that have ever existed do. And then the third requirement, of course, was microstamping. That's the one that Harris implemented or certified as needing to be required on new models of handguns. And so that effectively led to about a decade there where Californians could not buy new models of handguns because nobody makes microstamped guns. It's not a thing. It's theoretical technology that no gun manufacturer anywhere in the world, not just American makers, but nobody has ever produced a gun that has microstamping technology in it. And there's a lot of questions as to whether it would be viable in real life. But regardless, it doesn't exist. And so nobody is in production, at least. So there have never been guns produced. So there were never new models of firearms being added to the California roster until California Rifle and Pistol Association lawsuit in conjunction, I believe, with several other gun rights groups, I think SAF and NRA. But regardless, they managed to get the that requirement struck down, and then California stopped defending it and even repealed it, I believe, and put a new requirement, a new future potential microstamping requirement down the line in place. So, but the key point is Glocks are not safe handguns according to the state of California, even though you can buy them. They are on the roster. I've seen some reporting on the Daily Caller got this wrong. There are Glocks on the California roster. They are grandfathered in. They are older generation Glocks, Gen 2, Gen 3 Glocks. You can buy those on the roster in California. But it's not because they have the requirements. It's because they're grandfathered in. So that's one thing. There's a lot more, right? Like, she supported a handgun ban in 2005, as we've reported. We broke that story or got the additional confirmation to break that story a couple weeks ago. When did she buy her gun, right? Did she have it when she supported that handgun ban? What was she planning to do with it if she did? There's a lot, right? What changed? Why did she change her mind? She argued to the Supreme Court in an amicus brief during the Heller case that the Second Amendment doesn't protect an individual right to own handguns. Why does she own a handgun, right? And
Right.
Has she changed her mind, or does she think because she was a prosecutor, she should be exempted from that rule? Like, we don't know anything on that one. She didn't get into
to that end. What size is the magazine, right? Does she fall under a law enforcement exception? Does she get a full size magazine, or does she comply with California's magazine limit? We don't know that either. So
she answers very basic questions. She owns a Glock, which, it's a very popular kind of gun to own. So maybe that'll help her politically in some ways. We're going to have Tim Miller on the show from the Bulwark to give us maybe a pro Harris point of view on this stuff, and also like give his analysis on what he thinks this is doing in the race, if it's effective or not. But yeah, it's a very common. It's sort of, I think I called it the Toyota Corolla of guns, or the Ford F-150 or the Honda Civic, whatever you want to analogize it to. It's just a very popular, reliable, no frills gun that a lot of people own. And maybe that makes her more relatable to some gun owners on a sort of vibes level. She owns it for self-defense. That's a kind of gun most gun owners own, and it's for the reason most gun owners. And this is a little bit different from it's not a new line from Democrats, but it's a little bit of a twist on it. So
yeah. Getting into, as we're coming up on time here, getting into some of the newsletter links that we want to touch on. One of them is interesting, comes to us from the AP, sort of an update on the whole Massachusetts saga we talked about, I think last episode, or maybe the one before. The signature effort to get a repeal of their new gigantic gun control law, put it to the voters to see if they can get it repealed. So that campaign has officially, at least they say, they've collected enough signatures and submitted them. I'm sure there's probably some vetting process to make sure they're valid signatures. But at least at this point, it looks as though they have the required signatures to get it on the ballot. So in 2 years, Massachusetts voters will get to decide if that law stays on the books or not.
Yeah, 2026. And it's sure, I guess Governor Healy was correct to be worried that they were going to get enough of a grassroots effort to block the law's implementation because, as you reported, was last week, I think, she used an emergency declaration to implement the law immediately, 2 months after it was passed. Right. But, the emergency seemed to be that these activists were going to get enough signatures to block it if she didn't do that. So, and it seems like they weren't bluffing because, they got enough signatures to put this on the ballot now. And I guess it'll be a ballot fight in 2 years. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out.
But that move does make it so that in the interim of those 2 years, that law will be in effect because she did take that emergency step.
And it'll be challenged in court too. So there'll be a legal fight as well.
There's already a couple lawsuits. The NRA and its state affiliate are challenging the rule in court. So we'll obviously stay on top of that as well to see how that turns out. I know we also wanted to touch on, we had a couple of stories that one more explicitly than the other referenced sort of our work on the guns and Kamala Harris. We linked to both in the newsletter, but I know you wanted to say something on this from the difference between New York Times and Semaphore.
Yeah, the New York Times I thought their piece was interesting. I mean, like I just mentioned, I don't think what Harris is doing is a new tactic for Democrats. If you read the piece, they talk about this a bit. So it's a pretty well reported piece. Joe Biden and Tim Walz are good examples of how Democrats have traditionally done this, gun owner outreach effort, which is just to say, I'm a gun owner, I own shotguns, and I like to use them for mainly hunting. But I want common sense gun reform. I don't think you need AR-15s, right? As Joe Biden famously said, just get a double barrel shotgun if someone tries to break into your place and shoot 2 rounds into the sky and they'll run off. I don't know that that's very good tactical advice for a home defense situation, especially because it involves shooting off both rounds of the ammunition you have loaded in your gun before somebody, before actually encountering the person trying to harm you. But regardless, Harris's spin on it is, as I just mentioned, is probably a bit more relatable to most gun owners. Whether that, and we'll talk about this, I think, at length on the interview podcast with Tim, but whether that appeals, who that's going to appeal to and whether it works is another question. But it is a little bit of a twist on what they've traditionally done. Anyway, the Times, to their credit, notes that the fact she owns a handgun creates these questions that we just mentioned. Namely, like, if you own a handgun, why did you support banning handguns at two different points in your career? And they apparently not only have they never responded to us on those questions, they also are apparently not responding to the New York Times. And the New York Times links to the PDF that we first reported of the actual proposition and the language of it, but does not link to our story breaking that news, or give us credit for it, which I did actually reach out and complain to them about. And I got an email back that said they were, they heard about it. There was a White House press briefing where the story came up, I think from a Fox reporter, mentioned it and asked the White House about it. And, I'm sure, that's how they found out about the story and didn't realize it came from us. They said that they would try to make a change, and I just haven't seen the change implemented yet. So I'm a little bit, a little annoyed because the Reload is a very small outlet. When we break a big story and a bigger outlet picks it up and follows it, that's good. And that matters more than whether we get credit, but I would still like to see us get credit. But the other story we saw was from Semaphore, which talked about, again, a lot of the same themes of Harris's attempt to pave a different path on guns, at least on gun messaging, than Biden was. So in that one, they actually quoted me. I think it's a good story as well. Even better story because I'm quoted in it.
Yeah, that's right.
So you guys should check out both of them. They're good pieces. I just wish the Times would give us, the credit we deserve for breaking the story. I don't know.
It would be nice.
It's not the biggest deal in the world, but it is one of those things. Anyway, that's I think that's all we've got for this week. What you got anything fun coming up this weekend, or anything fun recently that you did?
This weekend, I'm drawing a blank right now on the spot. Watching sports, the Broncos are rolling right now. 3-game win streak. Rookie Bo Nix taking over the league. You heard it here first, folks.
I picked against them this week in my pool, but
we're going to make you regret
that
it.
Probably means they're going to win because I'm not very good at the pool. I did win last week, though. I won the tiebreaker last week from when I tied 2 weeks before. So, yeah, I think this is the first time I've won in like 3 years in 1 week. But whatever, it is what it is. It's still fun to do anyway, just with friends. It's not. I try not to gamble too much generally because I'd be broke. I'm not that good at it. But I actually went shooting over the weekend. The Phillies collapsed, but maybe it's because I didn't skeet. So when I went skeet shooting on Saturday with some friends and my girlfriend, and it was so much fun. I love skeet shooting. It was sporting clays. Yeah, it was a whole course. The best one was this was a Bull Run Shooting Center, so it's actually state run. Like skeet shooting and trap shooting and sporting clays range. A lot of fun out by the battlefield in Manassas, Bull Run. And yeah, had a great time. I thought the most fun stages were they had a rabbit stage, which is where they roll the clay along the ground, and then it has like a little ramp that it jumps up. That's a lot of fun. And then the best one though was they had a stage where the clays, if you did them as a double, they would consect at one point, and so you could hit them both with one shot.
That's cool.
If you did it right, and I did do it right several times. I mean, it's wind and the way the place flies is not always perfectly consistent, but sometimes they would get in just the right spot and you could hit them with one shot and they both break and explode. So much fun. So much fun. My shoulder is still maybe a touch sore from, I think we did we bought 900 clays and I think we did 350 or maybe almost 400. So pretty good day. And then the Phillies won that game. And then I didn't do any clay shooting before game 4 and the Phillies lost. So maybe it's my fault. I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe
you
it's
did
the
them
stupid
in.
Phillies going cold as they always freaking do in the playoffs at some point. So who knows? Could be either one. Anyway, I'm ready to watch the Eagles lose on Sunday, I guess.
The pessimism is great.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all we've got for you. I'm going to hand it off to myself to tell you a little bit about the Dispatch. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Ala Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news, in the same way that we do here at the Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.